They denied a dying girl one dipper of water, and before the next sunrise, Red Hollow would wish it had remembered what mercy looked like. The day Elias Boone rode into Red Hollow, the heat had already turned mean. It sat over the town like a grudge, pressing down on every roof plank, every wagon wheel, every man too tired to smile and too proud to admit it. Dust hung in the air without moving. Even the flies seemed lazy. The only sound that carried clean across the open square was the long wooden groan of the well rope turning over its wheel, slow and dry, as if the town itself was pulling water up from the bottom of a bad conscience. Elias came in from the south trail on a dun-colored horse with a tired gait and a dark stripe down its back. The animal looked like it knew every hard mile between Arizona and Sorrow. Elias looked about the same. He wore a sun-faded hat, a plain work shirt gone pale at the shoulders, and a canvas coat that had seen better winters than this one. There was nothing on him that called for attention. No silver spurs. No polished revolver grips. No swagger. Just a man somewhere past 30, with dust at the hem of his coat and the stillness of somebody who had learned not to waste words on people who liked the sound of their own voices. He reined up near the well and looked once at the bucket, once at the few townsfolk gathered in the shade of the general store porch, and then up at the sun, white and pitiless over the roofs. A woman by the hitching rail fanned herself with a folded newspaper. Two men sat in tilted chairs outside the saloon, hats low, eyes narrow. The sheriff stood in the doorway of his office, not doing much of anything, which in towns like Red Hollow often passed for order. Elias slid down from the saddle, boots landing softly in the powder-dry dirt, and led his horse to the trough. The trough was nearly empty. The horse lowered its head anyway, more out of hope than expectation. Elias rested one hand on its neck. "Easy," he said, quiet as the wind before dawn. Then he turned toward the well. Nobody greeted him. Nobody asked where he was from. A stranger in a dry town was not a man, not yet. He was a question. Elias reached for the rope, but before his hand could close around it, something moved at the far edge of the square. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just a shape wavering through heat and light, small at first, then smaller somehow, as though the closer it came, the more life it had already lost on the way. A young woman stumbled out of the glare beyond the blacksmith shed, one hand pressed against her side, the other hanging loose. Her dress was dust-stained buckskin. Her braid had come partly undone. Her face was drawn tight with thirst, lips split pale under the sun. She could not have been more than 19. The square went still in the way a room goes still when truth walks in wearing the wrong clothes. Someone on the porch muttered one word under his breath. Apache. That was all it took. The air changed. The woman made it 3 more steps before her knees weakened. She caught herself on the well post with both hands and lowered her head, not begging, not speaking, just breathing like each breath had to be pulled over thorns. Elias looked at her. Then he looked at the bucket. Then at the people watching. No one moved. A chair creaked on the saloon porch. The sheriff shifted his weight but stayed where he was. The woman by the rail stopped fanning herself. Every eye in town was on that girl and on the water behind the wood planks and the rope and the old habit of deciding who counted as human and who did not. Elias took one step toward the well. And that was when a voice from the porch said, flat and sharp, "Leave it be." The voice came from the porch of the saloon, but it belonged to the whole town. It was the kind of voice a place like Red Hollow grew over time, dry as old timber and twice as stubborn. Elias did not turn to look at the man who spoke. He did not need to. He had known that kind all his life. Men who mistook custom for character. Men who believed meanness became respectable if enough people stood beside it. His hand closed around the rope anyway. The hemp felt rough and hot against his palm. For a second nothing moved but the wheel overhead, rocking once in the sun. Then the same voice said, a little louder now, "You heard me." Elias glanced at the girl. She was still leaning against the post, shoulders trembling, breathing shallow and careful, as if each breath cost more than the last one. Up close she looked younger than he had first thought, though the desert had carved years into her face in a single afternoon. Dust clung to her cheekbones. A narrow strip of blue beadwork hung from one wrist, almost hidden beneath the grime. Her eyes lifted only once. Dark, steady, not pleading. That struck him harder than anything else. She was thirsty enough to collapse, and still she was trying to keep her pride standing. Elias had seen that look before, on cattle hands after a hard winter, on widows collecting feed on credit, on boys pretending hunger was not hunger if they said nothing. It was the look of someone refusing to hand their dignity over with their need. The sheriff stepped down from his doorway at last, hat brim low over a face made dull by habit. "No trouble today," he said, though his voice carried no more authority than a dust devil. "Best keep things simple." Elias looked at him then, not angry, not surprised, only tired in a way that seemed older than the man himself. "Simple," he said, and the word sat there a moment between them. He drew the rope. The bucket dropped into the dark with a hollow splash that seemed too clean for such a dirty hour. The wheel creaked. The line tightened. Elias pulled, steady and unhurried, shoulders working under the faded cloth of his shirt. No one stepped forward to help. No one needed to. They were all helping in the way they knew best, by doing nothing at all. When the bucket rose into the light, beads of water ran down the staves and darkened the dust at his boots. The smell of it came cool and mineral, almost sweet. It changed the air. The girl stared at it with the stillness of a person looking at Sunday after a week too long. A man on the porch laughed once through his nose. Waste of good water. Elias set the bucket on the well ledge and took up the tin dipper hanging from a nail. It was dented along one side and polished bright at the rim by 100 hands that had likely never wondered who had gone without before them. He filled it carefully, not to the top, just enough to keep it from spilling. Then he turned and held it out. The girl looked first at the dipper, then at him, then past him to the ring of faces waiting to see what kind of fool he meant to be. Elias kept his hand steady. "Drink," he said. She hesitated only a breath before taking it. Her fingers brushed the metal, then his knuckles, cooled despite the heat. She raised the dipper in both hands and drank slowly, with the discipline of someone who knew thirst could punish greed. The whole square watched her swallow. Watched life return one careful sip at a time. And in that silence, Red Hollow began to show its true face. The girl lowered the dipper with both hands, and for a moment nobody in Red Hollow seemed to know what to do with the sight of mercy made plain in the middle of town. Water still clung to the rim, bright in the hard sun, and one cold drop slid down over her fingers and disappeared into the dust at her boots. It was such a small thing, hardly worth a thought in a decent place. But Red Hollow was not a decent place when the weather turned hard and fear found a name to wear. The man on the saloon porch pushed his chair forward until its front leg struck the boards with a sharp knock. He was broad through the shoulders, dressed in a vest too dark for the season, with a watch chain across his belly and the expression of a man who believed ownership extended as far as his voice could reach. This was Harlan Pike, the saloon keeper, and in a dry town a saloon man often fancied himself second only to God, provided God charged for whiskey. "That water is for paying folk," he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Every person standing there knew he was not really talking about water. The woman by the rail resumed fanning herself, though slower now, as if even that small motion had become uncertain. One of the seated men spat into the dirt and looked away, embarrassed not by cruelty, but by having to witness it so close. The sheriff stopped near the well and rested his thumbs in his belt, eyes moving from the girl to Elias and back again. He looked like a man hoping time itself might step in and save him from choosing. The girl held the dipper near her chest, not drinking again until she understood the room around her, though there were no walls and no roof but heat. Elias took the bucket handle and set it more securely on the ledge. "She needed water," he said. His tone was plain, almost gentle, which only made Pike harder in the face. Need does not make law. Elias looked at the dry square, the crooked storefronts, the warped hitching posts, the wagon tracks cut deep into pale earth. Then he looked at the well, old boards silvered by sun and hands and years. No, he said. But it ought to teach it something. That landed heavier than if he had barked it. Pike came down from the porch one step at a time, slow enough to draw the town with him. The boards gave a low complaint under his boots. Behind him, the batwing doors stirred and two more men drifted out into the light, not close enough to take part, just near enough to belong to the same kind of thinking. The sheriff gave a small sigh, already tired of the afternoon and everything it was becoming. Boone, he said, having heard the name from the livery boy when Elias rode in, best let this settle. Elias did not answer right away. He was watching the girl. Color had returned faintly to her face, but she still swayed on her feet, and there was dust caked along the hem of her dress like she had come farther on less than most people could imagine. Around her wrist, the blue beadwork glinted once in the sun, delicate and stubborn. She handed the dipper back to him with both hands. "Thank you," she said softly. Her English was careful and clear. That unsettled the crowd almost as much as the drink itself. It is easier to deny a person when you pretend you cannot understand their voice. Elias gave the smallest nod. Then he dipped the tin cup again, filled it halfway, and held it toward her once more. This time Pike stepped closer. "I said. Enough." Elias turned his head just enough to see him. There was no challenge in his face. Only that same quiet, steady thing that had brought him to the rope in the first place. "You said it," Elias replied. "That does not make it right." And under that white Arizona sun, with the bucket sweating cool against old wood and the town staring like judgment had been invited in unannounced, the afternoon took one more step away from custom and toward truth. For a long second, nobody moved. The well rope hung still. The bucket rested on the ledge with a skin of cold shining along its rim, and the whole town seemed to stare at it as if water itself had chosen sides. Harlan Pike stopped 3 feet from Elias and planted his boots in the dust. He was close enough now for the smell of cigar smoke and stale liquor to drift off his vest. His face had gone flat in that dangerous, ordinary way some men wear when they think decency has insulted them in public. "You do not get to decide how things are done here," he said. Elias held the dipper where it was, steady in one hand. "Looks to me like I just did." A few people on the porch shifted at that. Not because the words were loud. Because they were not. In places like Red Hollow, calm could unsettle folks more than anger ever did. The girl looked from one man to the other, then lowered her eyes again, as if she knew too well what happened when pride in one person woke pride in another. She had taken only a little water, but some strength had returned to the line of her shoulders. Not much. Just enough to stand without the post doing all the work. The sheriff cleared his throat, the sound small and dry under the noon heat. "That is enough now," he said, though no one could tell whether he meant Pike, Elias, or the girl whose very presence had become a trial. "Let the matter pass." Pike did not look at him. The matter passed when people knew their place. Elias heard that and turned his head just slightly, not toward Pike this time, but toward the row of faces gathered under the sliver of shade. The woman with the newspaper. The 2 men in tilted chairs. The barber standing in his doorway with lather still on one hand. A boy no older than 12 near the hitching rail, watching all of it with the hard attention children give to the moment they first learn what grown folks really are. Elias had seen towns like this before. Not the buildings. Not the names. Just the arrangement of souls. A place where fear dressed itself as order and called that wisdom. He set the tin dipper down on the well ledge and reached into his coat. At once the air tightened. Pike drew in a breath. The sheriff straightened. Even the boy at the rail leaned forward. But Elias only took out a worn leather purse, untied the cord, and counted coins into his palm. The silver made a plain, honest sound in the heat. He laid 2 pieces on the wood beside the bucket. "There," he said. "For the water she drank. And for the water she has not finished." Pike glanced at the coins but did not touch them. Something in his eyes changed then, because money had settled nothing. That was the trouble with a man like Elias. He had stepped outside the rule Pike wanted to enforce, then stepped outside the excuse behind it too. The girl lifted her gaze. For the first time there was something in it besides exhaustion. Not trust exactly. Not yet. But surprise, maybe. The kind that comes when a stranger behaves the way a person ought to and nobody around him does. Elias picked up the dipper again, filled it from the bucket, and handed it back to her. "Slow," he said. She nodded once and drank. The second time was different. The first had been survival. This one carried relief, and relief has a sound to it if you stand close enough. Not a word. Not a sigh. Something softer. Around the square, people looked anywhere but at her. Pike finally bent, scooped up the 2 coins, and held them between finger and thumb like they offended him by existing. "You think paying for a thing makes you noble?" Elias rested one hand on the neck of the bucket. The wood was cool and damp under his fingers. "No," he said. "I think denying it tells on a man." The words landed clean. The kind that do not echo, because they do not need to. A breeze came through then, thin as a whisper, carrying the smell of hot sage from beyond town and stirring the loose edges of the girl's braid. Somewhere out behind the livery stable a horse stamped once in the dust. The moment might have broken there. It might have thinned and scattered and let everyone retreat into whatever lie they preferred. But the girl finished the second dipper, and before anyone could stop her, she reached into the fold of her buckskin sleeve and drew out something small tied to a narrow strip of leather. She looked at it only a moment, then placed it carefully on the well ledge beside Elias's hand. It was a silver coin, worn smooth at the edges, stamped with an old mark no one in Red Hollow seemed to recognize. Then she whispered, for remembering, and the square went quieter than before. No one in Red Hollow reached for the coin. That was the first strange thing. In a town where men noticed silver faster than weather, the little piece lying on the well ledge might as well have been a live coal. Sunlight touched its face and pulled a dull shine from the old stamp pressed into it, something curved and unfamiliar, not the clean eagle and wreath the territory favored, but an older mark, worn by years and hands and distance. Elias looked down at it, then at the girl. She had already lowered her hand. Her fingers trembled once, then went still. For remembering, she had said, and the word stayed over the square like a church bell after the sound was gone. Harlan Pike gave a short laugh that did not fool anyone. "Looks like payment from nowhere," he said. "Keep your trinket. Water costs coin that counts." The girl did not answer him. Her eyes were on Elias now, dark and steady beneath the dust on her brow, as if she were trying to decide what kind of man could ignore a whole town and still speak as softly as he did. Elias picked up the silver piece. It was cooler than he expected, though it had been sitting in plain sun. A narrow strip of leather ran through a small hole near one edge, and the leather was old but well cared for, rubbed smooth by use. There was weight to it beyond the metal. Not money. Meaning. He could feel that much. He closed his fingers around it and slipped it into his coat pocket without a word. Pike saw that and frowned, not because he wanted the coin, but because he did not like anything he could not measure. Around the square, the crowd had begun to thin in the cautious way people leave a scene they do not wish to be judged by later. The barber stepped back into his doorway. The woman with the newspaper folded it tight under one arm and walked off without looking at the well again. One of the men from the porch muttered that the heat was making everyone foolish and headed toward the shade. That is how conscience usually departs in a place like that, one excuse at a time. The sheriff stayed where he was. He kept one hand on his belt and studied the dirt near his boots as though it held a better answer than any face in town. "You have made your point," he said at last. Elias rested the dipper on its nail and drew the bucket back from the ledge so it would not tip. "I was not making one." The sheriff looked up then. "Could have fooled me." Elias glanced toward the girl. She had taken one careful step back from the well, as if she understood that standing too long in the center of another people's anger could be mistaken for safety. "No," Elias said. "A point is for men with time." She was thirsty. The sheriff had nothing to put against that. He only gave a tired breath and touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, not in respect, not exactly, but in surrender to an afternoon he no longer controlled. Pike turned away with the coins Elias had laid down still pinched in his hand. "Do not bring that horse to my trough," he said over his shoulder. "And do not expect a room in my place." Elias did not answer. That was answer enough. When Pike climbed back onto the porch, the boards gave a hard complaint under his boots, and the batwing doors behind him swallowed 2 men who had been brave only while standing near him. The girl watched them go. Then she looked toward the south edge of town, toward the open country beyond the last shack and the pale hills rising in the shimmer. Whatever road had brought her here had not finished with her yet. Elias picked up the half-bucket and poured a little into the horse trough beside him. The dun-colored horse lifted its head, ears twitching, and drank with slow gratitude. When Elias turned back, the girl had moved a few steps away. "Can you ride?" he asked. She shook her head once. "Not today." Her voice was stronger now, though still worn thin by heat and miles. Elias studied the harsh line of the road, the unkind eyes still watching from windows and porches, the long afternoon stretching ahead without mercy in it. Then he removed his canteen from the saddle horn, felt what little remained inside, and held it out to her. "Take this," he said. She hesitated, and for the first time something like caution touched his features. Not fear. Just the old knowledge that kindness always costs more in places where it ought to be free. "Go on," he said. "Looks to me like this town has already shown me what it is worth." The girl looked at the canteen as if it were something too costly to accept twice in one day. The leather was sun-dark and cracked along the seam, light in Elias Boone's hand because there was not much left in it, yet heavy in every other way that mattered. Around them, Red Hollow had gone back to pretending it was a town instead of a verdict. A wagon rolled somewhere beyond the feed store. A screen door snapped shut. From inside the saloon came the faint clink of glass and the low murmur of men already working to talk themselves innocent. But out by the well, under that white Arizona sky, the truth of the afternoon still stood in plain view. The girl took the canteen at last with both hands. "I will return it," she said. Elias gave the smallest shake of his head. "Just return to shade before the sun finishes what the road started." Something like the beginning of a smile touched one corner of her mouth, gone so fast a man might have missed it if he blinked. Then she drew one careful drink from the canteen, no more than a mouthful, and stoppered it again. That told him nearly as much as the coin had. People who had known real scarcity learned early not to trust comfort, even when it was offered kindly. She stepped back once more, eyes moving past him toward the open land beyond the last corral and the long line of pale hills wavering in the heat. "There is cottonwood north of the wash," Elias said. "A quarter mile, maybe a little more. Not much, but enough shadow to sit under." She studied him for a moment. "You are not from here." "No," he said. "That much is plain." She looked toward the well, then toward the porch where Harlan Pike stood half in shadow, pretending not to watch. "Good," she said softly. Then she turned and began walking toward the north edge of town, not fast, not steady, but with the kind of stubborn pace that comes from having no spare strength to waste. Elias watched until the glare swallowed part of her shape and the rest became only motion against the dust. He did not follow. He knew better than to crowd a person after they had been cornered by a town. Instead he led his horse away from the square and around behind the livery, where the boards cast a sliver of shade no wider than a bedroll. The livery boy, freckled and all elbows, looked up from sweeping and stared at him with the wide-eyed caution of somebody trying to decide whether kindness was a brave thing or a foolish one. "Mr. Pike says you are not to use the trough again," the boy said. Elias loosened the cinch and slipped the saddle from his horse's back. "Then I reckon Mr. Pike has found himself another job besides pouring whiskey." The boy nearly smiled, then thought better of it. Elias rubbed the horse down with an old cloth and let the animal nose what dry hay remained in a corner bin. By late afternoon the heat had changed character. It was no cooler, only lower somehow, spreading long shadows from the buildings and making every board in town look tired. Elias sat on an upturned crate beside the stable wall, hat tipped over his eyes, though he was not sleeping. In the pocket of his coat, the silver coin rested against his chest with a strange, steady weight. Once he drew it out and turned it in his fingers. The worn mark caught the sun for an instant, then dulled again. He traced the hole where the leather cord ran through and thought about the girl's face when she placed it on the ledge. Not gratitude alone. Intention. As if she had not simply paid a debt but marked a door. Toward sundown, the wind changed. It came down from the broken country beyond town carrying sage, dry stone, and something else beneath it, faint as memory. Horse smell. More than one. Elias lifted his head. The livery boy was still sweeping, slower now, drawing little half-circles in the dust. Somewhere in the square a dog that had slept all afternoon rose and gave one uncertain bark toward the north trail, then fell quiet again. Elias closed his hand around the coin and listened. The town did not hear it yet. But the evening had begun to gather itself, and far beyond the last weathered fence post, something was on its way. By the time the sun dropped behind the low western ridge, Red Hollow had begun to shrink into evening sounds. Harness chains clinked softer. Doors closed quicker. Voices lowered without anyone agreeing to it. The heat still clung to the boards and packed earth, but the light had changed, and with it came that old frontier feeling that daylight had only borrowed the land for a few hours and was now giving it back to whatever waited beyond the last fence post. Elias Boone sat beside the stable wall with his hat pushed back and the silver coin turning slow between his fingers. The stamped mark on it meant nothing to him by law or trade, but it had the look of something that belonged to a promise rather than a purchase. He slid it back into his pocket when the livery boy stopped sweeping. The boy stood very still, broom angled in both hands, eyes fixed toward the north trail. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Elias had been hearing it for the better part of a minute. Not clearly. Not yet. Just the faint, gathered pulse of distance carried through dry ground before it ever reached the ear clean. He rose from the crate and stepped out from the narrow shade behind the stable. At first there was nothing to see beyond the town edge but open country laid flat beneath the dying light, the wash cutting pale through the scrub, and beyond that the broken line of mesas holding the horizon like old, dark teeth. Then the dust appeared. Not a storm cloud. Too low for that. Too measured. It lifted in separate veils and settled, then lifted again. Riders. More than a few. The dog near the feed store barked once, sharper now, then retreated under a wagon. The livery boy swallowed hard. Should I get the sheriff? Elias looked toward the square. The sheriff was already there, stepping out into the last gold of the evening with one hand resting near his belt, not from courage but from habit. Harlan Pike came onto the saloon porch behind him, vest still buttoned, jaw set hard, eyes narrowed toward the north as if suspicion could make distance smaller. One by one the town arranged itself to witness what it feared. The barber stood in his doorway with his sleeves rolled. The woman with the newspaper peered through the hotel window lace. Men who had been loud over cards a few minutes earlier now stood silent in the road, hats pulled low, trying to look ready for a thing they did not understand. Elias did not move closer to them. He stayed near the stable, one hand on his horse's neck, feeling the animal's skin twitch under the dust. The horse heard it now too. Ears forward. Head high. The riders came on at a steady pace, not rushed, not sneaking, not spreading wide like men looking to surround a place. That struck Elias first. Whatever this was, it carried purpose rather than panic. As they neared the wash, the light caught bits of metal, beadwork, leather, horse sweat dark on narrow shoulders. There were 8 of them. Then 10. Then 12 as the last of the dust opened. Apache riders, moving in a line clean as handwriting. No one in town spoke the word this time. They did not need to. Fear had already recognized its favorite shape. The sheriff planted his boots in the center of the square and lifted one hand, perhaps to show control, perhaps to ask the evening for mercy. Pike stayed half a step behind him but tried to look like he belonged in front. Elias saw all of it and kept his face still. He counted the riders again. 12. Not an army. Not a raid. A message. The lead rider was older than the rest, sitting straight in the saddle with the kind of quiet balance that made younger men seem noisy by comparison. To his left rode a broad-shouldered man with a scar along his jaw. To his right, a younger rider carrying no raised weapon, only a long staff with strips of cloth tied beneath the handhold. The cloth moved softly in the evening breeze. Behind them came the others, alert but unhurried, their horses stepping through the edge of town as though they had entered places like this before and found little worth admiring. Then Elias saw her. She rode in the second rank on a dark bay mare, posture straighter now, color returned to her face in the gentler light. The dust was still on her buckskin dress, the blue beadwork still at her wrist. She looked neither frightened nor triumphant. Only resolved. The livery boy whispered something under his breath that Elias did not catch. It did not matter. The square had gone so quiet that the creak of saddle leather sounded loud as a gate hinge. The riders halted near the well. The old man at their front let his horse settle, then turned his gaze slowly across the town, taking in the saloon porch, the sheriff, the windows, the bucket hanging by the rope, the faces arranged in caution and shame and stubbornness. At last his eyes found Elias near the stable. They stayed there. The evening held its breath. Then the old rider spoke in a voice low and even, the kind that never needed force because it had never depended on it. "Which man gave water to my daughter?" No one answered the old man at first. The question hung over the square like a lantern in a church after midnight, steady and impossible to ignore. "Which man gave water to my daughter?" Not shouted. Not accused. Simply placed there for every soul in Red Hollow to stand beside or step away from. The sheriff glanced left, then right, as if the truth might volunteer from somewhere safer than his own mouth. Harlan Pike kept his jaw set and his eyes narrow, but the color had gone thin beneath the sun still trapped in his face. On the porch behind him, the men who had leaned so easily into the afternoon now leaned backward from it, each one discovering all at once the usefulness of silence. Elias Boone stood with one hand resting on his horse's neck and the other near his coat pocket where the silver coin lay warm from his body. He did not step forward right away. He looked first at the young woman on the bay mare. In the evening light she seemed changed and not changed at all. The dust was still on her hem. The blue beadwork still circled her wrist. But now she sat high and steady in the saddle, not like someone rescued, and not like someone returning to settle a score. She carried herself the way certain people do when they have never had to borrow dignity from the room around them. Her gaze found his and held it. Then she gave the smallest nod. Elias walked out from the stable shade into the open square. His boots made almost no sound in the dust. "I did," he said. The old rider studied him for a long moment. Age had drawn hard lines at the corners of his mouth, but there was nothing brittle in him. His face looked carved by weather, patience, and the long memory of a people who had watched too many towns mistake power for virtue. At last he inclined his head once. "My daughter told me there was one man here who remembered the law older than towns." A faint stir moved through the square. Elias stopped a few feet from the well. "I gave her water," he said. That is all. The old man's eyes shifted to the well rope, the bucket, the porch, the sheriff, the faces watching from doorways and windows. That is never all, he said. Beside him, the broad-shouldered rider with the scar looked over the town with the calm dislike of a man who had expected little and found no reason to raise the estimate. The younger rider holding the staff remained still as stone. Only the strips of cloth moved in the light wind. The sheriff cleared his throat and stepped forward a cautious half-pace. Now see here, he said, trying on authority as if it might still fit. There has been no crime committed in this town. The old rider turned his head toward him, and something in the sheriff's words seemed to shrink before it reached the air. No, the old man replied. Only a measure taken. Harlan Pike found his voice then, perhaps because he could not bear a silence that did not belong to him. Your girl came in alone, he said. We did not know her purpose. The young woman on the bay mare looked at him, and there was no anger in her expression. That made it worse. My purpose, she said, in clear, careful English, was water. No one in Red Hollow seemed able to hold her gaze after that. The old rider reached inside his coat and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. He opened it in his palm. Another silver coin rested there, worn by age, marked with the same old stamp as the one in Elias's pocket. Murmurs passed through the square, low and uncertain. The old man lifted the coin for all to see. This mark is carried by my family, he said. My daughter gave hers to the man who treated her like a human being when others would not. He let the cloth fold closed again. That debt is not forgotten. The last light of day had gone amber now, brushing the tops of buildings, catching in the bucket rim, turning the dust in the square to the color of old copper. Elias reached into his coat and drew out the coin she had given him. He held it up once, not as proof, not as claim, only as answer. The old rider saw it and gave a single nod, deeper than before. Then he turned in the saddle and looked beyond the well toward the north edge of town where a shallow wash cut across the land. Many years ago, he said, before these boards and roofs, before this saloon and its porch, there was another spring near this place. It fed the wash even in August. It belonged to no one because water belongs to life. He let the word settle, and every person there understood without being told why he had come. Red Hollow had built itself beside one well and forgotten that the desert kept older maps. The old man rested his hand on the saddle horn. Tomorrow at first light, he said, my sons will open the buried channel above the wash. Water will come again. A sharp breath passed through the square. Even Pike could not hide his surprise. The sheriff stared, caught between relief and embarrassment, because mercy offered in public can shame a man more deeply than punishment. The old rider's eyes moved once more to Elias. Not for this town, he said quietly. For the one man in it who remembered. The riders left as quietly as they had come, and that was the part Red Hollow remembered longest. No raised voices. No threats. No demands written in dust or fear. Just the soft turn of horses, the brush of leather, the last amber light on the old man's face as he guided his people back toward the north wash with his daughter riding beside him. She looked once over her shoulder before the darkness took the trail. Not at the sheriff. Not at Pike. At Elias. Then she was gone with the others, and the square was left holding the weight of what had just been offered and what had just been revealed. For a while nobody spoke. The evening wind moved through town, stirring grit along the porch boards and setting the well rope to a faint dry sway. Harlan Pike went back into his saloon without a word. The sheriff stood in the street as if he had misplaced something and only now realized it had been his authority all along. One by one doors closed. Lamps were lit behind curtains. The town folded itself inward around a shame it did not know where to put. Elias Boone unsaddled his horse behind the livery and slept on his bedroll under the open sky, hat over his eyes, one hand resting near his coat where the silver coin lay. Sometime in the night he woke to the scent of cooler air drifting down from the wash. Not rain. Not exactly. Just the smell of turned earth and a promise moving under it. Before dawn the town was awake. People came out early, drawn by the same thing that had made them gather at the well the day before, only this time the feeling was not curiosity. It was need stripped of pride. The sky was still gray at the edges when Elias walked toward the North Wash. He passed the general store, the church with its plain white boards already yellowing in the dry country, the blacksmith shed, the silent porch of the saloon. No one stopped him. Some fell in behind him at a distance. Others were already ahead, standing along the rise above the wash in coats thrown over nightshirts, boots unlaced, hair uncombed, all the ordinary signs of people who had gotten out of bed too fast for dignity to keep up. Down below, the Apache men were already at work. Not in haste. In knowledge. 2 of them cleared brush from a narrow cut in the bank. Another lifted flat stones from a buried line that had once guided runoff toward a deeper spring pocket hidden farther up the draw. The old rider stood with the younger man carrying the staff and watched the ground the way a preacher watches a Bible, not reading words but remembering where they have always been. Naya was there too, kneeling near the edge of the channel, her braid retied, her face washed clean of dust, one hand resting on the earth as if listening for something underneath it. Elias stopped on the rise. He did not go down among them. This was not his work to claim. The sun edged over the far ridge, pale and cold at first, and then one of the men in the wash stepped back. A hush moved through the crowd on the bank. Nothing happened. Then the ground gave a low, wet sigh. A dark line appeared between the stones, no wider than a finger. It trembled. It widened. Water slid forward through the cut like something waking from a long sleep. Clear at first, then clouded with loosened silt, then clear again as it gathered itself and ran. Not a flood. Not a miracle in the noisy sense. Just a living stream returning to a place that had forgotten how to deserve it. A woman near the church put a hand over her mouth. The livery boy laughed once before he remembered himself. Even the sheriff removed his hat. The channel filled by inches, then by feet, carrying the cold shine of morning down toward the lower bend where the old spring basin had collapsed years before. The Apache men worked with shovels and bare hands, opening the last of the blockage so the water could find its former course. By the time the sun stood an hour above the ridge, the basin below held enough to reflect the sky. Red Hollow had been given another chance, and everyone there knew exactly whose decency had brought it to their doorstep. Harlan Pike came late, vest buttoned, face stiff, as if he hoped arriving after the wonder would spare him from standing too close to the truth. It did not. He found Elias near the edge of the basin filling a tin cup for his horse. For a moment Pike seemed about to speak in the same tone he always used, the one that mistook hardness for rank. But the words did not come out that way. "Looks like you were right," he said at last, and even then he could not say about what. Elias handed the cup first to the livery boy, who had run down beside him red-faced and thirsty from excitement. "No," Elias said, watching the boy drink. "Looks like she was." Pike stood there with nothing to do and no place to set his eyes. That was punishment enough. Later the sheriff tried to thank the old rider. The old man accepted the courtesy with the same calm he had carried into town the evening before, then said the water would remain open as long as the town remembered what had happened at the well. No papers were signed. No oath was taken. None was needed. The condition hung plain as sunlight. By noon buckets were being filled at the restored basin. Women carried pails home. Horses drank deep. Children splashed their hands and laughed until their mothers hushed them, not because joy was wrong, but because too much joy in one place can sound a little like apology. Elias kept to the side of it all. He watered his horse, rolled his bedroll, and tightened the saddle cinch with slow, practiced hands. When he was ready to leave, Naya approached him from the basin carrying his old canteen. It had been cleaned. The leather looked darker where fresh water had touched it. She held it out. "I said I would return it." Elias took it and nodded. Looks like you did more than that. She glanced toward the basin, where townsfolk moved in careful silence around a gift they had not earned. Not for them, she said. For the one who remembered first. Elias considered that, then looked past her to the channel shining under the noon sun, to the boy helping his mother lift a bucket, to the sheriff standing bareheaded in thought, to Pike on his porch with no words left large enough to hide in. Maybe that will be enough, he said. Naya studied him with that same steady gaze she had carried. Through heat, thirst, and the judgment of strangers. Sometimes one drink is enough to tell you what a town is, she said. Then, softer, and what a man is. She turned and walked back toward her people. Elias mounted up a minute later. No one tried to stop him. No one asked his name again as if it had only now become worth knowing. He tipped his hat once to the livery boy, then guided the dun horse south out of Red Hollow at the same quiet pace he had ridden in. Behind him the town went on drawing water beneath a sky that looked cleaner than it had the day before. Ahead of him the trail opened into heat and distance and all the miles a man could travel without ever finding a place that had learned the lesson of a well. In his coat pocket, the silver coin moved lightly against his chest with each step of the horse. He did not take it out. He did not need to. Some things a man carries are not meant to be spent. And in Red Hollow, long after the dust settled back into the road and the story passed from porch to porch and from one dry season to the next, people said the town had been saved by a hidden spring. But the ones who had stood at the well that first afternoon knew better. Water had only followed where mercy opened the ground.